They wore crowns of gold, gowns of silk, and jewels worth kingdoms. But behind the palace walls, queens and princesses lived with lice in their wigs, rotting teeth, poisonous makeup, and childbirth so horrific it could kill them. What if I told you that history's most beautiful women hid the filthiest secrets of all? Stay with me till the end as we uncover the 10 worst hygiene practices royal women endured. And don't forget to subscribe, because the truths I'm about to reveal will change the way you see history forever. When we think of queens and royal women from history, the first images that come to mind are dazzling crowns, glittering gowns, and grand palaces filled with luxury. We imagine elegance, refinement, and beauty on a scale that ordinary people could never dream of. But what if I told you that behind all the jewels and silk, the lives of these women were far from glamorous, that beneath their golden crowns and perfumes, they lived with filth, disease, and horrifying hygiene habits that would shock us today? This is the hidden, darker side of history's most powerful women, the 10 worst hygiene practices of royal women. To begin, let's talk about something that seems basic to us: bathing. Today, most of us bathe daily, or at least several times a week. But centuries ago, bathing was not only rare, it was feared. Many royal women believed that immersing their bodies in water opened their pores and let in deadly diseases. Doctors of the time even recommended against it. They insisted that dirt on the skin acted as a natural barrier against illness. So, queens and princesses would avoid water entirely. For example, Queen Isabella of Castile was famously said to have bathed only twice in her entire life, once as a child, and once before her wedding night. Imagine the life of a queen who covered herself in perfumes and powders but never truly washed. This wasn't unusual, it was the standard. Perfume replaced soap, and heavy layers of gowns covered the stench. Behind the grandeur of royal courts, the air was filled with the scent of roses and lavender, desperately trying to cover the stench of sweat, dirt, and decay. Now think about hair care. For royal women, long hair was a symbol of beauty and power. But washing hair with water and soap was extremely rare. Instead, they used powders made of crushed herbs, flowers, and even flour to mask odors and absorb oils. At first it might sound creative, but the reality was horrifying. These powders attracted lice, fleas, and other insects. Infestations were so common that queens and princesses had servants whose job was to comb through their hair and pick out lice with fine-toothed combs. Queen Elizabeth I of England is one of the most famous examples. She wore elaborate wigs to cover her thinning hair, but those wigs themselves were crawling with vermin. Can you picture the glamorous queen sitting on her throne with a jeweled crown, while beneath it, her wig itched with lice? Court life may have sparkled on the surface, but behind closed doors, scratching heads and lice-filled wigs were an everyday reality. And then there were their teeth. Royals loved sugar, which was a luxury reserved for the wealthy. Cakes, candies, sweet wines, queens and princesses consumed them all, and it destroyed their teeth. They had no modern toothpaste, no toothbrushes, no dentists as we know them. Instead, they rubbed their teeth with cloths or brushed with mixtures of ashes, crushed herbs, or even ground coral. These methods wore down their enamel and left their gums bleeding. Queen Elizabeth I's teeth were so decayed and blackened from sugar that she struggled to eat. And yet her courtiers copied her, painting their own teeth black to mimic her appearance. Imagine that. Rotting teeth became a fashion trend because it symbolized wealth. For royal women, smiling often meant revealing not pearly whites, but dark, crumbling teeth. Clothing, too, carried its own horrors. Royal gowns were breathtaking velvets, silks, and intricate embroidery, but they were rarely washed. Washing could ruin expensive fabrics. So instead, dresses were brushed, aired out, and perfumed. Underwear, if worn at all, was kept on for weeks, sometimes months. Heavy layers of fabric trapped sweat, dirt, and odors against the skin. During menstruation, there were no modern sanitary products. Instead, queens used cloth rags, which were washed and reused, though often not thoroughly. Some accounts suggest that women simply allowed blood to soak into their skirts and gowns, hidden by layers of fabric. Think about what that meant. Royal banquets, ceremonies, and meetings with ambassadors, all while enduring such conditions. For women who were supposed to represent refinement and grace, their private reality was far more unpleasant. Even the palaces themselves added to the unhygienic nightmare. From the outside, places like Versailles or Hampton Court looked like marvels of architecture, but inside, the smell was unbearable. Toilets as we know them didn't exist. Royals used chamber pots, and servants often dumped the waste in hallways, courtyards, or streets. At Versailles, visitors wrote about the overwhelming stench. Beautiful gardens and gilded halls masked a reality of overflowing waste and unwashed bodies. Royal women, sitting in silk gowns and diamond jewelry, were still surrounded by the odors of filth. Imagine walking through those glittering corridors while the smell of urine and rot hung in the air. This was the daily life of queens and princesses. Cosmetics made things even worse. Pale skin was the height of beauty, a sign of wealth because it showed you didn't work outdoors. To achieve it, royal women applied dangerous mixtures of lead, vinegar, and mercury to their faces. These substances ate away at their skin, causing sores, rashes, and permanent damage. Queen Elizabeth I relied on Venetian ceruse, a white lead-based paint, to cover scars from smallpox. Over time, her real skin decayed beneath the makeup, making her even more dependent on it. Other royal women used coal, made of toxic antimony, for eyeliner, which damaged their eyes. In pursuit of beauty, these queens poisoned themselves every day. What looked glamorous in portraits was, in reality, a mask of chemicals slowly killing them. Oral hygiene was equally horrific. Toothaches were constant, and extractions were brutal. Without anesthesia, a barber or untrained servant would yank a tooth out while the queen screamed in agony. To cover bad breath, royal women chewed on herbs, cloves, or spices, but it only disguised the decay. Imagine being in a ballroom filled with nobles whispering secrets to each other, not with fresh breath, but with the sour stench of rotting teeth and gums. Even the most powerful women in the world couldn't escape the misery of oral disease. Another shocking reality was the lack of proper hand. Today, washing hands with soap is basic hygiene, but in palaces, it was often just symbolic. Before meals, bowls of rosewater were offered for nobles to dip their fingers, but this was ritual rather than actual cleaning. Without real soap, germs spread quickly. Food poisoning, dysentery, and stomach illnesses plagued even the wealthiest courts. Royal women, expected to represent health and beauty, were often sick themselves. The irony is striking. The most powerful women lived in golden palaces yet suffered from the same diseases as peasants in villages. Childbirth was perhaps the most horrifying of all. Queens were expected to produce heirs, but giving birth was one of the most dangerous experiences a woman could face. Delivery rooms were filled with attendants, nobles, and midwives, but none had sterile tools or medical knowledge. Infection, known as childbed fever, was common and often fatal. Many queens died young while trying to fulfill their duty to bear children. Remedies prescribed to ease pain or encourage birth included bloodletting, herbal concoctions, or even bizarre superstitions, none of which worked. Behind the grand titles of queen and empress were women terrified of a process that could end their lives at any moment. So when we picture the glamour of history's queens, we must also remember the reality. They may have worn crowns, but their teeth were rotting. They may have lived in palaces, but those palaces reeked of waste. They may have painted their faces with white powder, but that powder was poisoning them. They may have been admired by their people, but in private, they endured filth, disease, and discomfort that we would find unbearable. Their lives were far less enviable than history makes them seem. This was only the beginning. In the next parts, we will dive even deeper into the shocking world of royal hygiene, from the dangerous beauty treatments they swore by, to the lice-filled wigs they wore proudly, to the strange and deadly remedies they believed in. The truth is, the private lives of queens and princesses were not the fairy tales we imagine, but grim realities hidden beneath silk and jewels. In part 1, we pulled back the curtain on the myths of royal elegance, exposing how queens and princesses often lived in filth behind their glittering images. But that was only scratching the surface. To truly understand how grim their private worlds were, we need to step further into the palaces of Europe and beyond, where luxury existed side by side with lice, disease, and horrifying practices that would make anyone today shudder. In this part, we will uncover even more disturbing realities about how royal women lived, suffered, and even poisoned themselves, all while being adored as symbols of beauty and refinement. Let's begin with the infamous French queen, Marie Antoinette. She is remembered for her towering hairstyles, lavish gowns, and the line she never actually said, "Let them eat cake," but behind the image of wealth. Her hygiene tells a different story. Her hairdos were not just tall, they were monstrous constructions of wigs, padding, and hairpieces that sometimes reached more than 2 feet high. To build these creations, hairdressers used animal fat, powders, and perfumes. But this sticky mixture was a paradise for lice and fleas. Once the hair was styled, it could remain in place for weeks at a time. Women slept upright on special pillows so as not to crush their hairstyles. And while their hair remained intact, so did the infestation. Accounts from the time tell of royal women scratching constantly, sometimes using long needles or sticks to reach beneath the wigs. Rats, yes, actual rats, were said to be attracted to the scented powders and food crumbs that fell into the hair, nesting in the elaborate towers of curls. Imagine Marie Antoinette, dazzling in a ballroom with chandeliers reflecting off her jewels, while inside her hair, vermin crawled unseen. It sounds like a nightmare, yet it was reality. If Marie Antoinette's hair was terrifying, Catherine de' Medici of France added another horrifying layer to royal beauty routines. Obsessed with maintaining a youthful appearance, she turned to deadly cosmetics. Like many royal women of her time, she used white powders made with lead and arsenic to create pale, flawless skin. But Catherine took it further. Her court became famous for producing dangerous perfumes and potions, many of which contained poisonous substances. These cosmetics didn't just damage the skin, they seeped into the body, slowly causing illness, weakness, and in some cases, death. Some historians believe her experiments with toxic mixtures contributed to her declining health in later life. To the outside world, she appeared as a powerful queen mother, controlling politics from behind the throne. But behind closed doors, she was slowly poisoning herself in the name of beauty, her skin cracking beneath the layers of toxic paint. England offers its own grim stories. Queen Elizabeth I, known as the Virgin Queen, set fashion trends for her entire nation. Her signature look included her pale face, fiery wigs, and extravagant gowns. But beneath that powerful image was a woman plagued by disease and decay. After surviving smallpox, her skin was left scarred, and she relied heavily on white lead makeup to cover the marks. The more she used, the worse her skin became. Her teeth, destroyed by sugar, turned black and rotten. Visitors to her court described her as majestic from a distance, but up close, her breath was foul and her teeth so decayed she struggled to speak. Servants noted her wigs, filled with powders and perfumes, were crawling with lice. And yet, Elizabeth maintained her image, never appearing without her mask of lead paint, jewels, and silk. In portraits, she looked like a goddess. In person, she was a woman slowly deteriorating, clinging to the illusion of youth. Then there was Empress Catherine the Great of Russia. Though she is remembered for her intelligence, power, and scandalous romances, her hygiene habits reveal another side. Catherine lived in palaces where bathing was still rare. She preferred to mask odors with perfumes rather than water. Her lovers often complained of her strong scent, but no one dared to criticize her openly. Reports suggest that her undergarments, rarely changed, carried stains and odors. For a woman who ruled the largest empire in the world, she was still a prisoner of the same unhygienic customs that plagued all royal women of her time. Her love of luxury could not hide the reality that perfumes and silks were only thin veils over dirt and decay. Royal women also had to endure horrifying medical practices. One of the worst was bloodletting, a common treatment for everything from fevers to headaches. Queens and princesses were regularly subjected to this. Their veins cut open to drain blood, in the belief that it balanced the body's humors. This weakened them further, leaving them pale and fragile. Combined with their dangerous diets, poor hygiene, and constant childbearing, it was a recipe for misery. Imagine a queen lying in her chamber, already weakened by childbirth, and then ordered to have blood drained from her arm, because her doctors believed it would make her healthy. These practices killed countless women who might otherwise have survived. Childbirth itself remained one of the most terrifying aspects of royal life. Consider the tragic story of Jane Seymour, the third wife of England's King, Henry VIII. She gave birth to the future king, Edward VI, but died shortly after from childbed fever. The room where she delivered was packed with people, nobles, servants, midwives, none of whom understood the importance of cleanliness. Tools were unsterilized, hands were unwashed, and infection spread easily. For queens, giving birth was not a private moment, but a public duty, performed under the eyes of courtiers eager to see an airborne. Many women, including queens, died in agony on these beds. Their names remembered in history, but their suffering often forgotten. In Spain, Queen Isabella I, already known for her extreme lack of bathing, also followed strict religious practices that made hygiene even worse. She believed in mortification of the flesh, which meant neglecting the body as a sign of piety. Instead of washing, she wore the same clothes until they fell apart. She fasted to the point of illness. She saw dirt and discomfort as symbols of holiness. To her, and to many others at the time, physical cleanliness was considered less important than spiritual purity. But the result was a body plagued with disease, infection, and odors that not even the finest perfumes could hide. And what about the palaces themselves? The Palace of Versailles, one of the most beautiful and famous in the world, was a nightmare behind its golden gates. There were almost no proper toilets. Nobles relieved themselves in stairwells, hallways, and gardens. Chamber pots were emptied onto the ground. The stench was unbearable. Imagine royal women in massive gowns, walking through glittering halls filled with diplomats and nobles, all while the smell of waste lingered in the air. Their delicate shoes often stepped in filth. The most refined court in Europe was, in truth, one of the dirtiest places imaginable. Even food carried its own horrors. Royals feasted on meats, pastries, and sweets, but food was not preserved well. Spoiled meat was often covered with spices to mask the taste. Food poisoning was common, leaving women doubled over in pain. Water was often unsafe to drink, so they relied on wine or ale, which only added to their health problems. Combined with poor hygiene and lack of medical knowledge, their diets slowly destroyed their bodies from within. When we put all of this together, the image of royalty becomes something far less desirable. Behind the portraits of glowing queens were women with rotting teeth, lice-infested hair, unwashed bodies, and poisoned skin. They lived in palaces that smelled of waste and disease. They endured childbirth without medicine, treatments that weakened them, and beauty routines that scarred and killed them. Their wealth and power could not protect them from the horrifying hygiene practices of their time. Yet what makes this even more fascinating is the contrast. These women were adored, painted, and immortalized as symbols of beauty, purity, and grace. Their portraits, carefully touched up by artists, showed smooth skin, shining hair, and elegance beyond measure. Their people worshipped them as semi-divine figures. But the truth, hidden in the shadows of their palaces, was far less flattering. They suffered in silence, trapped by traditions, customs, and ignorance. And in doing so, they left behind a legacy that is both glamorous and grotesque. The worst hygiene practices of royal women remind us of an uncomfortable truth. History is not always what it seems. Behind every crown lies a story of pain, disease, and survival. These women were not only rulers and fashion icons, they were human beings, struggling with the same bodily realities as everyone else, but without the knowledge or means to handle them. Their lives may have been rich in jewels and palaces, but they were poor in comfort and hygiene. By now, we've already peeled away the layers of silk and jewels to reveal the shocking realities of royal women's hygiene. But if you thought lice-ridden wigs, poisonous cosmetics, and disease-filled palaces were disturbing, wait until we move into the most intimate and secret aspects of their lives. Because behind closed doors, in the most private parts of their routines, queens and princesses endured practices so shocking, so unhygienic, and so dangerous that they make the glamour of royalty seem like nothing more than a painted lie. One of the most overlooked aspects of royal life was menstruation. In an age without modern sanitary products, queens were forced to improvise. Linen cloths were the most common option, but they were rarely cleaned properly. Instead, they were reused until they rotted. Some women even used sponges soaked in vinegar, which not only caused infection, but could also poison the body. There are records of women inserting rags into themselves and leaving them for days, leading to horrific odors and sometimes fatal infections. Yet these same women were expected to appear in public ceremonies, dancing, dining, and smiling, while secretly suffering discomfort and pain. Queen Victoria's journals reveal how openly she noted her monthly cycles. But for queens in earlier centuries, it was a hidden curse. Servants whispered about the smell. Doctors prescribed bloodletting to balance the humors, and royal husbands sometimes blamed infertility on uncleanliness. The very thing that made royal women so valuable, the ability to produce heirs, was tied to practices that damaged their health and dignity. But menstruation was not the only intimate challenge. Consider the way waste was handled in palaces. In Versailles, Hampton Court, and even the Kremlin, toilets were almost non-existent. Chamber pots overflowed, and women in heavy gowns struggled to relieve themselves discreetly. To make matters worse, undergarments often lacked anything resembling modern convenience. Some historians believe that noble women wore no underwear at all, making it easier to squat over chamber pots hidden behind curtains. The stench inside these rooms was unbearable. Servants emptied chamber pots out of windows, sometimes onto unsuspecting pedestrians below. A queen could be dressed in pearls and diamonds, yet her chamber reeked of urine and waste. And with no proper sewage systems, diseases spread easily. Dysentery and infections were common killers, not just of peasants, but of royals themselves. Bathing, or rather, the lack of it, was another horrifying aspect of royal hygiene. We think of queens lounging in marble baths, surrounded by rose petals. But in truth, many women believed bathing was dangerous. Doctors claimed that water opened the pores and allowed disease to enter the body. As a result, queens sometimes went months, even years, without a full bath. Queen Isabella of Castile, one of the most powerful monarchs in history, reportedly bathed only twice in her entire life. Catherine de' Medici was said to have avoided bathing for fear of illness, relying instead on perfumes and scented gloves. The skin became coated in layers of sweat, dirt, and cosmetics, creating a breeding ground for disease. Parasites thrived in these conditions, spreading from body to body in crowded palaces. When these queens did finally bathe, it was often in water that was already dirty, shared by multiple people, leaving them no cleaner than before. Royal dentistry, or what passed for it, was equally gruesome. Sugar was a luxury imported from colonies, and royal women consumed it in massive quantities. Queen Elizabeth I of England became infamous for her black, rotten teeth. Visitors described how her mouth gave off a foul odor, her breath unbearable. Dental hygiene was almost non-existent. Toothbrushes existed, but were rare, and toothpaste was made from crushed shells, soot, or even urine. Some queens chewed herbs or rinsed with wine, but these did little to stop decay. Extractions were performed without anesthetic, often with dirty instruments that caused more infection than relief. A royal banquet might have been dazzling, but many queens sat at the table, covering their mouths, embarrassed by rotting teeth that no amount of jewels could hide. But the most shocking hygiene practice of all may have been the use of cosmetics made from deadly ingredients. We already saw how Catherine de' Medici and Elizabeth I relied on white lead and arsenic powders. But it wasn't just them. Across Europe, noble women painted their faces with substances that slowly destroyed them. Venetian ceruse, the most famous cosmetic of the Renaissance, contained lead carbonate. Women applied it daily to achieve a ghostly pale look. Over time, it caused headaches, hair loss, rotting gums, and even brain damage. Mercury was used in ointments to smooth skin, but it also caused tremors and madness. Belladonna, meaning beautiful woman, was used to dilate the pupils, creating a wide-eyed effect, but it was toxic, damaging eyesight permanently. Imagine a queen sitting on her throne, eyes gleaming unnaturally wide, her skin ghostly pale, while underneath her body was breaking down from poison. Another disturbing practice was the handling of childbirth and postpartum recovery. Royal women were often confined in dark, overheated chambers during pregnancy, with curtains closed to block out light. It was believed that fresh air could harm the baby. When labor began, the room filled with nobles and doctors, creating an unhygienic environment ripe for infection. After giving birth, women were often purified in ceremonies before returning to public life, but their bodies rarely healed properly. Many developed prolapses, infections, and fevers. Some, like Anne of Denmark, suffered repeated miscarriages, worsened by poor medical practices. In an age before antibiotics, a simple infection after childbirth could mean death. And yet, the pressure to produce heirs forced women to endure pregnancy after pregnancy, each one more dangerous than the last. Even clothing itself became a source of filth. Royal gowns were magnificent, covered in embroidery, jewels, and fine fabrics, but they were rarely washed. Washing ruined delicate materials. So gowns were often worn repeatedly until they smelled so strongly of sweat and perfume that they became unbearable. Instead of cleaning clothes, royals changed into fresh layers of linen, which absorbed sweat but were not always washed regularly. Corsets, tightly laced, trapped dirt and odors against the skin. Parasites like lice and fleas found easy homes in the folds of fabric. While peasants were mocked for being dirty, queens themselves lived in garments that were breeding grounds for disease. Perfumes became the solution to nearly every problem. Royal women carried scented gloves, handkerchiefs, and pomander, small containers filled with spices or herbs to block the smell of waste and disease. But perfume was not just for pleasure. It was survival. Palaces reeked of unwashed bodies, rotting food, and overflowing chamber pots. Perfumes were a shield, but they could never fully mask the truth. Behind the heavy scents of roses, lavender, or musk, there was always the lingering stench of decay. And what about the people closest to the queens, the servants who dressed them, combed their hair, and cleaned their chambers? They too suffered from the same unhygienic practices. Lice spread easily among everyone in the palace. Servants carried chamber pots, cleaned filthy gowns, and dealt with the aftermath of childbirth. Disease did not discriminate between noble and servant, and often, epidemics began in palaces before spreading to the cities. When you piece all of this together, the dirty childbirth chambers, the rotting teeth, the lice-filled wigs, the deadly cosmetics, the perfume-saturated gowns, it becomes clear that royal life was far from glamorous. These women may have worn crowns, but they lived in conditions that today would horrify even the poorest among us. The contradiction between their wealth and their filth is staggering. They were admired as the highest example of beauty, but in reality, their bodies told a story of suffering, disease, and decay. What's even more fascinating is how much effort went into hiding the truth. Portraits were painted to erase flaws. Records were edited to present queens as flawless beings. Artists smoothed away scars, brightened complexions, and straightened teeth. History remembers them as glowing, radiant figures. But the hidden reality was far darker. Royal women were trapped in a world where appearances mattered more than health, where beauty was bought with poison, and where survival meant enduring horrific hygiene practices that slowly destroyed them, and yet, they endured. These women, despite their pain, fulfilled their duties, ruled nations, and left behind legacies that still shape our world today. But perhaps their greatest secret is not their political influence or their romantic scandals, but the hidden truth of their daily lives, truths that history tried to bury beneath layers of perfume, silk, and lies. We have already seen the horrifying realities behind royal women's lives, the wigs crawling with lice, the poisonous cosmetics, the unwashed gowns, the reeking chambers, and the painful childbirths. But the story is not complete yet, because some of the most disturbing hygiene practices were also the most symbolic. They were not just about survival. They were about power, about appearances, about forcing queens to suffer in silence to maintain the illusion of perfection. One of the most shocking practices was bloodletting. Doctors of the time believed that nearly every illness stemmed from an imbalance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. To cure women of everything from headaches to infertility, physicians ordered them to be cut open and drained of blood. Noble women submitted to these procedures in lavish chambers, often while already weak or ill. Sometimes leeches were applied directly to their skin, leaving behind scars and infections. Queens were bled during pregnancy, during menstruation, even during fevers, all in the misguided hope that it would restore balance. In reality, it only weakened them further. Imagine a queen, pale from sickness, being drained of her blood while wearing pearls and satin. Her suffering was hidden behind velvet curtains, while outside the people believed their monarch lived a life of divine health and luxury. Another disturbing detail was the use of communal items. In palaces, combs, basins, and even bathing water were shared. A comb used by one queen might later be used on her ladies-in-waiting, spreading lice from person to person. Basins for washing hands at banquets were passed around, the water quickly turning cloudy and foul. There are stories of women dipping their fingers into wine instead of water, to disguise the lack of cleanliness. At times, even childbirth tools were reused, uncleaned, from one royal birth to another. The thought is almost unbearable. Disease passed along not by peasants but by the very women meant to embody purity and grace. Food and dining customs added to the horrors. While banquets looked grand, with golden goblets and silver platters, the hygiene behind the scenes was dreadful. Meat was often undercooked or spoiled, preserved with salt until it reeked. Flies swarmed around the dishes, and hand-washing was minimal. Queens and princesses, seated at the center of these feasts, were expected to eat delicacies crawling with bacteria. Cutlery was rare, and many ate with fingers, licking them clean between courses. In some courts, it was fashionable to wipe greasy hands on the long, trailing skirts of gowns. Even in their most public moments, royal women could not escape the filth. But perhaps the worst practice of all, the one that sums up the contradiction of royal life, was the way death itself was handled. When queens died, their bodies were prepared for burial using methods that, by today's standards, were shockingly unhygienic. Embalming techniques were crude, involving spices, wine, and wax, but often failed to stop decay. In some cases, organs were removed and stored separately, placed in jars or hidden within churches. The smell of rotting bodies sometimes filled the palace for days. There are records of royal funerals where the stench was so strong that mourners fainted. For a woman who spent her life covered in jewels and perfume, her final moment was often one of filth and decay, proving that even queens could not escape the unhygienic realities of their world. When we look back at these 10 practices: lice-infested wigs, poisonous cosmetics, lack of bathing, rotting teeth, filthy clothing, perfume as survival, horrific childbirth rituals, bloodletting, unclean dining, and unhygienic death, we see a pattern emerge. These women, despite being at the very top of society, were not spared from suffering. In fact, their status often made it worse. They were forced to endure these practices to maintain appearances, to keep traditions alive, and to fulfill their roles as symbols of beauty, fertility, and power. It is easy to imagine peasants living in dirt and disease, but far harder to accept that queens and princesses, who lived in palaces of marble and gold, faced the same filth only dressed up in silks and perfumes. The truth is that history's most admired women, painted in glowing portraits and celebrated in poetry, were prisoners of their own bodies. Their jewels could not hide the lice. Their perfumes could not erase the smell of waste. Their powders could not cover the scars left by disease. And their crowns could not protect them from the consequences of dangerous medical practices. What makes this even more haunting is how little they could do about it. Unlike today, where hygiene is a matter of personal choice, royal women had no choice at all. Their diets, their clothing, their medical treatments, even their bathing schedules were dictated by tradition, superstition, and politics. They were trapped in a cycle of suffering, forced to pretend that their lives were perfect, when in reality they were filled with pain and humiliation. And yet, despite it all, these women carried themselves with dignity. They smiled at banquets, they stood on balconies before cheering crowds, they bore children for dynasties, and they ruled empires. They endured lice, rot, disease, and bloodletting, and still they shaped the course of history. Their resilience is perhaps the most astonishing part of all. When you think of a queen, you probably imagine her as a figure of grace, power, and beauty. But behind the crown was a human being, just like us, only forced to live under conditions that today we would find unthinkable. To understand their lives fully, we must look not only at their palaces and politics, but also at their hygiene, their suffering, and their hidden struggles. The next time you see a painting of a glowing queen, remember the truth that history tried to hide. The pearls and diamonds are real, yes, but so were the lice, the rot, the filth, and the pain. The real story of royal women is not just one of power and beauty, but of survival against the horrors of their own world.